Today we discuss the algebra of running, and we'll attempt to answer one key question: how to run faster. But first, the fine print. There are multiple algorithms to be able to do this. There are many paths that people have taken. The Ingebrigtsens, Emil Zatopek, Eliud Kipchoge all took their own paths to success. I've got Olympic marathon coach Lindsey Parry with me today, and he's going to show you what's worked for him and what we share with our athletes here at coachparry.com. The circumstances of your birth, unfortunately, do make a big difference. A lot of your success and failure isn't your fault. I don't know about you, but I wasn't able to choose my parents, so winning the gene lottery doesn't work for everyone. The good news is what we're going to show you today works for athletes of all abilities. So, Lindsey, what is the algebra of running?
From my experience, it boils down to this formula. The product of volume to the power of 3 and strength plus the product of intensity and chasing volume divided by rest multiplied by recovery and consistency minus the product of illness and injury.
I know that's a mouthful, but it boils down to this. If you want to improve your running performance, it comes down to this secret formula. Lindsey, let's start with volume. Why is volume so important?
Well, Brad, volume is the amount of kilometers or time that you are spending training. And what's really important about volume to begin with is that you want to train for where you are now, not for where you want to be. There are 3 important components that make up volume: frequency, duration, and intensity. And that's why we've got volume to the power of 3. So the frequency of volume is quite literally how often am I running? And that is going to differ depending on your goals, depending on your age, and depending on what your ability is and where you personally are in your training cycle. And that could be anywhere from 3 times a week to 6 times a week if, for example, you're an elite athlete. Then we are going to look at duration, how long a particular session is. Now that's going to depend entirely on the goal outcomes of that session. We've got long runs, we've got shorter easy runs, we've got recovery runs, and then of course we're about to jump into intensity, but the intensity of that session will determine how long that session is. And then finally we jump into intensity, and that is all around how hard sessions should be done. And it talks to how many high intensity sessions versus low intensity sessions should we do. At Coach Parry, we really like to work roughly around the 80-20 principle, which is to say that 80% or more of your training should be done at an easy intensity and 20% or less should be done at a high intensity. And that essentially are the 3 components that make up the volume of training. Now, one of the things that a lot of people get wrong is that they assume that the more you can train or the higher your volume is, the better you will run. And that is true to a point before we get to, firstly, a point of diminishing returns, where the fatigue that you build up is too much and it starts to interfere with the progress that you're making, and it leads to injury or illness when we really go beyond that line. The secret is to add strength training, and that's why it's the next part in the equation, because if we add strength training, we make the body stronger, which has direct performance implications, but importantly, creates a stronger system that can withstand more training. So if you're doing the right strength training, you can also sustain a higher volume of training.
So while on the subject of strength training is so important that we've actually created a free resource for you that you can download and do at home. It's a free strength training plan. You can click on the link on screen right now to download it, or click on the link that's in the description. So that's the first part of the equation: volume cubed and strength. Next, we look at intensity and chasing volume. Lindsey, before we look at chasing volume, let's talk a little bit more about the role of intensity.
The importance of intensity in this equation is that if we train at the right intensity for both our easy sessions and our fast sessions, then we are going to elicit the physiological, neurological, and muscular changes that we want to allow us to run fast. So when we're doing easy training sessions, we want to be training well below threshold, because that's going to stimulate your body's ability to transport oxygen and energy to the working muscles, as well as get rid of the byproducts of energy metabolism from the muscles, and getting rid of, for example, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then when we get to our high intensity sessions, we're going to be able to perform those to the best of our ability, and that's really going to then drive that stimulation. And if we're doing the intensity as we're supposed to, we will be able to do a greater volume of training. So that brings us back to our volume in the equation, where if we're doing the right amount of volume and the right intensity of training, we can increase that volume. And we want to increase that volume taking into account where we are now in our training and pushing it up slowly. So the best way to do that, Brad, is to actually have a look at what training have I done over the past month versus what is the training I'm planning on doing this week. We don't want that ratio to exceed 1.3. So if we stay under that 1.3 ratio, then that increase in volume is probably safe. And then we have to take into account other things like resting heart rate, HRV, to kind of track when we're starting to get to the upper limit of that volume. We start getting to that point of diminishing returns. But if we're not chasing volume, but gently pushing it up while we're doing the appropriate things, like training at the right intensity, like keeping strength training, as we spoke about in the previous part of the equation, that will allow us to get to a point where we can do the optimal volume for us as individuals so that we can keep improving and run fast.
Okay, so that's the top half of the equation. Let's now look at the bottom half. Lindsey, to a lot of people, rest and recovery is the same thing. In your mind, what's the difference?
Yeah, so Brad, there's quite a big difference. And I would say that rest is probably an important component of recovery, quite possibly the most important, but they really aren't the same thing. Conceptually, rest is when we take some time off from what we are training for. So that would incorporate something like a rest day away from the exercise that we're doing. And that does allow the recovery process to really kick in. But it also has a mental side to it. So rest per se allows recovery to happen. It gives us a good mental break so that it allows us to also maintain the motivation that we need to keep training hard, keep pushing towards our goal. And it starts to allow recovery mechanisms to kick into place. And then there's also a lot that goes into recovery that can help recovery. So let me unpack that a little bit, okay? Rest and how we use it is important, because if we're not allowing rest days in our training plan, then we are going to compromise our recovery. So as we get older, and as we are training harder, it becomes much more important that we make sure that we have full days of rest where we allow optimal recovery to take place. And then we need to build in recovery cycles. Now, in your recovery cycle, you will add additional rest days, but you'll also pull down the volume, the intensity, and the duration of your sessions to allow you to recover better in those recovery weeks. We can also use a lot of things to help to improve or shorten the recovery cycle, using things like compression socks or compression boots, making use of things like ice baths, massage, and making sure that we are getting in the correct nutrition. You can also additionally use supplements, but I always say to people, unless we're getting the basics right, i.e. making sure that we're getting the right rest, we're getting the right nutrition, then we are not going to really benefit from using things like compression, supplements, and so on. So we really want to take care of the cornerstones. One of the most important cornerstones of recovery actually is sleep. So you really want to make sure that you are not compromising on sleep when you're training hard. And I would say rest and sleep are probably more closely related than the terms rest and recovery. So what happens during rest and recovery. Why is it actually so important? So if you are not allowing the recovery to take place, then muscles are not going to repair themselves properly in between bouts of exercise. That's going to compromise your ability to do the next sets of training, plus it's going to make you more susceptible to getting injured. When we are training, we spoke earlier about the improvements that we make during exercise. Now, those improvements will not happen. Even if you are training at the right intensity, if you don't actually allow recovery between those bouts of exercise, those improvements are not going to happen. So in other words, our capacity to move oxygen and to deliver energy to the working muscles is not going to get better, because you're not going to give your body enough time to actually respond and build more cells to produce more of the things that we need to make you a better athlete and to be able to run faster.
All right, so we've now covered the rest and recovery. Let's take a look at the role that consistency plays in this equation.
Brad, consistency is arguably the single biggest indicator of performance. Consistency is literally what we do day to day, week to week, month to month, and year to year. And that's where the power of training comes in. The longer we can string together training blocks and add them up on top of each other, the better your performance will be as an athlete. And that is why in the equation, consistency goes with rest and recovery. Because if we aren't getting the rest and recovery right, we can't have the consistency that we need. We can't train for month after month after month. Because we're not resting and recovering properly, we are going to get sick. We are going to get injured. The actual quality of our training is going to suffer, and we won't be able to put together those consistent blocks. We always say at Coach Parry that the initial improvements we see when we fix the structure of people's training is a big jump, but the next jump that comes from training, we hardly notice at the beginning, but suddenly when we look back and see what we've done over the last couple of months, we see, wow, look at how much we improved. And that is driven purely by the consistency of doing the right things at the right time over and over and over again.
Okay, so that's really cool. Now let's dig into the final part of the equation, and that is the two I's, injury and illness. Lindsey, what role does injury and illness play in this formula?
Well, the biggest role they play is how they impact consistency. So I think let's look at what the physical impact is when we miss out on training and when we interfere with our consistency. And what's always important for me to note, and what so few runners understand, is that they don't realize that if we miss a couple of days of training, there's very little impact on our fitness and our ability to progress. But if we miss longer, that's when it starts to impact. So very interestingly, if you missed a week of training, you'd hardly notice the difference. In fact, the increase in freshness will far outweigh the tiny loss of fitness. At week 2, that balance is still in the favor of freshness. So if you miss 2 weeks of training, there is going to be an impact on fitness for sure. We might have to make a little bit of an adjustment to the training, but on the whole, from a performance point of view, there's going to be very little change in your fitness. Once we get to week 3, we start to fall off a cliff. Week 4, 5, and 6 becomes really detrimental to our consistency and impacts on our ability to improve. And this is where so many runners make the mistake. Is that when they get injured, when they get sick, they worry about the 1 or 2 days of training. They try to ignore the fact that they're sick or that they're injured. They try to go, okay, if I just push through this injury, train a little bit less, but carry on training, that's going to have the least impact on my training and my consistency. However, what actually happens is that you turn that little acute niggle into something more serious and potentially into a chronic injury that now takes you weeks or potentially months to get over. And so the secret to the 2 I's, illness and injury, is really on minimizing the time that you are sick and injured. that will in turn minimize the amount of training that you miss. So rather be open to resting for 2, 3, 4 days in the short term, getting an injury or the illness dealt with, getting healthy, and then moving forward. And that is how you prevent them from negatively impacting your equation.
So there you have it, the mathematical equation on how to run faster. But like with most things in life, the theory is one thing, but knowing how to practically implement it in your life is another. If you watch the video that's on screen right now, we'll show you exactly how to do that, because this is how smart runners train.